Okay, so before I get started, I wanted to find out a little bit about folks who are here and just, be able to tailor my comments to what you all are interested in. So could you, in the Q&A, because we don't have chat apparently, so in the Q&A, could you all just post on a scale of 1, you don't know anything about CBPR or participatory action research, to 10, you know almost everything, to how much you feel like you know about this subject that we're going to be talking about this afternoon? So you'll just need to go to the Q&A and post something there. Yep. I'm not seeing anybody posting anything. I don't know if that means that they can't or that you just are not. I'm impatient.
I'm seeing some. I
Oh,
see a
there we go.
9,
Okay, I'm seeing it now.
a 4. Yeah, it just took a little. I think there might be
Oh, hey,
some
Melissa.
technical issues going on with bandwidth or something this afternoon.
Okay. Well, it looks like we got some 4s and 9. Chris is up to a 6 to an 8. So 6s. All right. And as we're going along, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A, and we'll kind of try to monitor that so that I can answer any questions you have. And then could you also just, if there are particular topics that you're studying that relate to, and you'd like to think about how that's going to relate to CBPR and PAR, if you could post that in the Q&A as well, just gives me a sense of what kind of examples are going to be most interesting to you all. Okay, next slide. So let me tell you a little bit more about my background in participatory action research. I've been, and we'll talk in a minute about terminology, CBPR versus participatory research versus participatory action research. I refer to the work that I do as participatory action research, but I think it's basically exactly the same. I think the histories of CBPR and PAR are a little bit different, but I think the practices and the values and a lot of the theoretical frameworks are very much aligned. So I've been doing this for like 40 years. My dissertation was a study of transportation needs of people with disabilities and accessibility issues. And we used a participatory action research model. The work that I'm doing now is the bio that you just heard suggest is around climate change. I decided about 10 years ago, after the encyclopedia came out, that I wanted to really focus the rest of my career looking at climate change, and just figuring that's sort of the most compelling problem facing us all as a planet right now, and I wanted to do my bit. So the FLASH project that you heard described, which is in the picture on the bottom right here, is sort of one way of doing that. I also do a lot of work with middle schoolers. That's a picture in the upper left-hand corner. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is a project that I'm doing in England and have been for 8 years. It's a social enterprise, which I think is really interesting. That's about asset-based community development. So I try to sort of keep a lot of things going at once, which is sometimes successful. Okay, go ahead. So basic terminology, as I said, there's a sort of an umbrella term of action research within which community-based participatory research and participatory research, as I say, I think are really aligned. In the United States, CBPR is primarily directed at sort of public health and well-being kinds of research, as opposed to other kinds of environmental or research that's going on in communities. But as you'll see, I think the practices and principles are all very much the same. Okay, go ahead. So let me talk a minute about sort of affordances. And if that's a new term to some of you, affordances are basically the qualities of the thing that make it possible for it to do the work it needs to do. So, if you think about a hammer, the affordances of a hammer are that it's got a hard end and a handle, and you can hit things with it. If you think about the affordances of CBPR, the qualities that make it possible for it to work, there are things like flexibility, creativity, playfulness, being problem-focused, being pragmatic, accessible to a large, variety of participants and people and co-researchers. It tends to be very place-based. And our goal is not to create generalizable knowledge, which would be the case in more traditional forms of research, but rather to create knowledge that's transferable, both in terms of the learning that we do about the issue, but also in terms of methodologies. Okay. So years ago, I co-authored an article for the first issue of the first volume of the journal Action Research, which is one of the primary journals in our field. And we asked all of the editors of this new journal why they do participatory research or action research. And people came from very different disciplinary backgrounds. People came from very different sort of topics that they were tackling, very different methodologies. The one thing that they all sort of had in common was a shared values stance, which is, I think, what brings us all together. And we describe that as having respect for people and the knowledge and experience they bring to the research process, a belief in the ability of democratic processes to achieve positive social change, and a commitment to action. Okay. So if you think about sort of the foundational theories behind participatory action research, or CBPR, we go all the way back to people like John Dewey and pragmatism. Kurt Lewin is oftentimes sort of, seen as being the kind of foundational theory for a lot of what is sort of thought of as sort of the northern traditions of action research. And then you've got people like Paulo Freire, who represent sort of a more critical, more politically engaged form of research. If I'd say if I align myself with anybody, it would sort of be Freire, Dewey, and then Levine, in that order, maybe. Okay, go ahead. In terms of CBPR, I don't know if any of you are like NPR listeners, but you know how they always talk about like the founding mothers of National Public Radio? Well, I think about these folks as sort of the founding mothers of community-based participatory research: Meredith Minkler, Barbara Israel, Nina Wallerstein, and Sarah Flicker. So, they're the people who kind of really talked about CBPR and wrote the book about sort of the two initial volumes were edited by some of these folks. Okay. So why do this? Why start thinking about doing CBPR? Both to deepen your knowledge of the issue, but also to generate data that can inform action, I think is an important part of it. Sometimes it's around looking at the effectiveness of something, so it's more about participatory evaluation, and to create knowledge that can drive advocacy and policy decision making. So it's very much an engaged form of knowledge generation. Okay. So this is something that Barbara Israel came up with. See what happens if you try to forward the slide here, because it should sort of, yeah, it's going to work. So it starts by forming a partnership. You can just go ahead and slide through all of those. And then really looking at community strengths. One of the important parts of CBPR, PAR, is that it, rather than taking sort of a deficit model of looking at what's wrong in communities, we really try to ground ourselves in what's going right and the strengths and relationships that people have. Then talking about problems, designing and conducting research together, feeding back and interpreting those data. Again, one of the things we'll talk about is how important it is to find all the way through alternative outlets and strategies for not just generating, but then disseminating knowledge or sharing knowledge out in communities. And it always sort of comes back to relationships. Sort of from the very beginning, that's the first part, is sort of forming a relationship. And those relationships are oftentimes ongoing, over years and years. I mean, I think about somebody like Brinton Likes, who's been doing work in Guatemalan Mayan communities since I first got to know her, which was decades ago. Okay. There we go. So how do you go about developing partnerships in communities? You can go to the next slide. There are lots of different kinds of communities. We often talk about sort of going into the community, but when we talk about that, we oftentimes fail to think very deeply about what kind of communities we're going into and how well established they are, how well organized they are, maybe what kind of tensions exist within those communities or factions. And it's important to spend a lot of time at the beginning learning more about the community, spending time in the community, so that you're able to negotiate all of those kinds of dynamics that are going on. Okay. So years ago, one of my former doctoral students came to me and said that this was when I was still at Cincinnati, so nobody at U of L. The student said that one of her other faculty members had told her not to do participatory research because it was lazy research. And I was so annoyed at the idea that this would be considered lazy research that I went home and I made up a whole list of all of the different kinds of tasks that we do, all of the kinds of roles that we have to play. And I was talking to my friend Alfredo Ortiz Aragon, and he and I have worked together a lot. And we talked about sort of how do you sort of take those roles and think of them in different realms of participatory research. And this diagram kind of captures the idea that there is a realm of traditional research. So people who do CBPR have to be trained in, traditional, both quantitative and qualitative research methods. But then there's also a whole realm of, skills, dispositions that we need to develop around going into communities and developing relationships in communities in ways that are ethically grounded and are sensitive to the needs of that community. Then there's sort of realms of dynamic sense making and of emergent design that are also important. And then finally, a realm of advocacy, which I think for many people sort of who come from a more conventional way of thinking about research is something that we actively should not be doing. And yet within CBPR, it's very much a fundamental part of what we need to do, is to really understand how we can take the research knowledge that we're generating and turn it into some kind of action to create positive change. Okay. So what levels of change do you want to see in an action research project? Go ahead. And I would argue that, we're trying to think about taking action and creating change on multiple levels. At the very least, we're creating individual change, that people that are working on projects are learning new skills, developing new ways of understanding, new knowledge bases, all of those kinds of things. But then the group of people that you're working with are developing relationships with one another. They're deepening their practice and understanding how to be more effective. And you've got levels of change all the way to, the possibility of creating change in legal systems, and international partnerships and change. So we sort of are trying to work on multiple levels simultaneously, maybe not all levels, but at multiple levels in any one project. There's a potential for that. Okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and we're going to go through these really quickly. And if any of you want to, email me after today's presentation, because I know I can't talk to you, and, we can set up a time to chat about any of these. But there are, when I know in the introduction it sort of talks about the Encyclopedia of Action Research. In the Encyclopedia of Action Research, there are over 100 different methods and methodologies included, which tells you something about the vast variety of ways in which we can generate data and then share data back out to the community. I like this photograph. This is actually a photograph from a study that got published several years ago that took place in Buenos Aires. And the researchers were asked to help the school district and the community figure out why young people were not attending school. And so they went and talked to the young people. And this photograph is taken, this is like a video project as part of the project that's taken sort of near the homes of the young people, all of whom lived in homes that were built sort of around one of the big garbage dumps in the city. And what the young people were saying to the researchers was, it's not that we abandon school, but when we go to school, we're teased, people give us a bad time about where we come from, we don't feel welcomed there. And what the participatory research was able to do was to indicate that it wasn't the children who had abandoned school, but rather the school that had abandoned the children. So the whole idea of sort of counter storytelling and counter narrative is oftentimes an important element of the kinds of data that we're able to generate as part of CBPR projects. Okay, good. So these are just a few methods that are distinct from, like I said, we can use very traditional quantitative and qualitative methods, but the difference is, who decides what the questions are, who owns the data, who gets to look at the data and decide what it means, who gets to decide how those data then get used to affect change. That's where, even more traditional methodologies and methods can be adapted and used in a CBPR project. But these are all things that have been developed more sort of designed for CBPR or participatory action research projects. And we'll talk about some of these just quickly. Okay, good. So I don't know if any of you have used fishbone diagrams. They're a very quick, easy way to bring a group together, and cheap. You'll notice that one of the sort of common elements of a lot of these things is because, there tends not to be huge funding. This NSF grant is like the first time I've had any significant amount of money, and it's kind of, I could get used to that. So go ahead with the next slide on fishbones. Oh, I thought there was another one. Anyway, on a fishbone, what you do is you sort of identify what the problem is, and then the bones of the fish you use to identify what's contributing to that problem. You can also turn it around and say, what's something good in the community and what's creating those positive changes. In general, I would say that people who use CBPR or participatory action research, because it's so sort of place-based, as I said, we tend to adapt the methods that we have to be usable in that particular context. So we tend not to be very rule-bound about how things happen. If you want to use a fishbone diagram in another way, go for it. Okay, good. World Cafe, I don't know if any of you have used World Cafe. One of my students, Erin Biesiker, is going to be using this. She's working with the Pride group, looking at suicidality for BIPOC LGBTQI folks. And she's going to be running a World Cafe. But the idea is that you bring a relatively large group of people together to have sort of conversations about a shared topic of shared interest, and people sort of move around from one table to another. So it is both a data generation sort of process, but it also allows people to share knowledge and get to know one another. So it's also a community building kind of project. And again, there's lots of other information about all these things. I'm just trying to whet your interest, and then you can email me and I'll tell you more about them all. Okay, good. Okay, you can go ahead. That's all right. Photo voice is one of my favorite methods. The idea here, and this is a picture actually from one of Brenton Likes' studies. And I think there's another slide to go after this. Go ahead. Yeah. So in photo voice, the idea is that you can use images and have people take pictures of some phenomenon in their own community that they want to address together. And you have people go out and take photographs. Used to be that, we would give people cameras, and that's still possible. But a lot of times, even in, communities that don't have a lot of resources, oftentimes people have phones and are able to do that. And then they bring them back and select photos, and then there's sort of a shared interpretation process called the showed process. And these are like the stages of the showed process. So you have people go through a process of talking about what's happening and what do you see and what's happening in that image, and then what does it mean for us? And then finally, how do we use the knowledge that we're generating through this process of thinking about these photographs in order to create some kind of change? I'm currently working on a project called the Ripple Effects Project, which is basically a photo voice project where we ask young people to take photographs about the importance of water in the community. And we actually run a contest here in the greater Louisville area called Ripple Effects Louisville through the public library that asks young people to take pictures about water and then write about why that picture was important to them. But we're also doing this now on an international basis. So if you're interested, if you look up Ripple Effects International and look at our website, you can see some of the other projects that we're sort of aligning with. And got one in England, one in Norway and Finland and South Africa, one in India that's really beautiful, developing some others. So anyway, that's a way of doing photo voice. Okay, go ahead. There's a lot of crossover ties between different kinds of indigenous forms of knowledge and indigenous community-based research. And participatory action research methods. So, the pictures here are from research done by a guy named Michael Kroll, who in the past, he's now retired, but a lot of his research focused on suicide prevention among youth in the Inuit community in Canada. And, sort of working with young people in those communities to identify ways in which sort of high levels of suicidality could be addressed, which ended up including sort of connecting more to elders, which is what that top picture is about, but also connecting more with each other, which I think is interesting. Okay, go ahead. There's a whole branch of youth participatory action research, which uses the same kind of methods. It's basically just ways of getting young people involved in doing as research partners in projects. But if you look up YPAR, you'll see a lot about that. And most of these things, if you look at the Encyclopedia of Action Research that we mentioned, there are entries on pretty much all of these methods and methodologies that are like 1,000 to 3,000 words long and have additional resources. So if you're interested in any of these things, you can probably find something there. And we have an electronic copy at the U of L library. Okay, go ahead. Appreciative inquiry and asset mapping. Appreciative inquiry actually comes out of business and organizational development, primarily the work of a guy named David Cooperrider and other folks. But the idea, if you're going to boil it down to like one sentence, is the idea of asking the positive question. So again, instead of sort of taking a deficit model of, any kind of setting, an organization, a business, a school, a community, we start by trying to ask what's going right and how do we understand and then build on that. And then asset mapping or asset-based community development comes out of a lot of community development work done by people like John Kretzmann and John McKnight. They wrote the handbook on ABCD. What those two approaches, even though they come from really different sort of backgrounds, have in common is the idea that we identify and build on strengths rather than always sort of being problem focused in what we're doing. And for a lot of the work that I'm doing, both the work that I do in Gloucestershire and England, that's all really grounded in an asset-based community development model. And the work that we're now doing out in Eastern Kentucky, again, it's really seeing what the strengths are in these communities and building out from that. Okay, go ahead. You can go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I thought I'd taken some of these out. I may have sent you okay, go ahead. This is just all the ways that we can sort of identify assets. Okay. That's all right. Go ahead. Go ahead. Okay. Fish bowls. When you think about sort of qualitative research methods and sort of, standard qualitative methods, include things like focus groups, which are really helpful, but a lot of our standard methodologies are all very researcher focused. It's kind of like a teacher focused classroom as opposed to a student centered classroom. In fishbowls, you get a group of people together sort of in the center of the fishbowl and then other people in the audience kind of around it. And it's sort of a permeable fishbowl so that the people who are in there and initiate the conversation will step out of the fishbowl and other people can come in. And there's light facilitation going on, in case a problem or people are taking up too much time, you can kind of help to guide it a little bit. But basically, a lot of participatory methods are about the researcher trying to stand back and just provide tools and strategies for people to be able to do the work themselves. Okay, go ahead. Theater of the Oppressed, there's a whole arts-based, wing of participatory methods and CBPR. Theater of the Oppressed, which sort of came out of the work of Augusto Boal, who was a Brazilian, both researcher and theater person, working at about the same time as Paulo Freire was in Brazil, developed this whole process called Theater of the Oppressed. That involves getting people involved in creating theater pieces to explore and portray issues that they're dealing with. I've worked with a group in England called the Misfits, which is a group of folks with intellectual kinds of challenges who have really used Theater of the Oppressed as their main sort of strategy for developing training methods for service providers, healthcare providers, that kind of thing. That's all about how they want to be treated by people who are providing any kind of support. Okay. Critical utopian action research is an approach to doing research that was developed by people at Roskilde University in Denmark. And it's basically kind of about what it sounds like. It's both critical and utopian in thinking, which I think right now, in the way the world is, trying to kind of have any utopian vision for the future that sort of also isn't just fooling ourselves is challenging. But I think critical utopian action research is a good strategy for doing that. Okay, go ahead. And one of their main methods is something called future creating workshops, which I've used a lot. You get a group together, usually, between 10 and 15 people, I would say, works best. And you start by identifying sort of whatever topic you want to study. And then you first look at what's contributing to this problem. There's a critique phase. Why does this problem exist? And then you sort of, everybody contributes to that. You set it aside. And then there's a utopian phase where you try to think about, okay, in the best of all possible worlds, what would we like this to look like? If we think about, say for us here at the university, how would we like ourselves to be treated as university faculty and students and staff people here? And we would think about, well, what are the challenges? And then think about, in the best of all possible worlds, what would we want to have happen? We'd all want to have, a beautiful place to work and relationships with people. And then the final phase is a realization phase where you take those two first pieces together and you think about, okay, if these are the problems, this is what we really want to see happen, how do we move forward to that, to that future? The Danes, when they do it, take days to do it. You can do it in a half day if you have to. Just don't tell the Danes. Okay, go ahead. So how do you find the right method? What kind of questions might you ask yourself? So go ahead. One question is, where are you in the process? If you're just getting started, something like fishbone diagrams, asset mapping are really helpful. If you're trying to create a research question, you might use something like concept mapping. So one thing to say is sort of, where are you in the process? Are you evaluating something? And what I've done here, and I can share these slides out if you all are interested, is to try to sort of think about at each stage of the process, which methods are going to be most appropriate, because this isn't generally just one thing. We often, one of the things about any kind of participatory process is that it tends to be an iterative process where we have one round of data collection and analysis and implementation of changes, and that drives the next round of research. And we often are using multiple methods as we go forward. If you're doing this as a student, that might not be as true because we have time limitations. If you're trying to do this as a dissertation, that's a different matter than if you're in a long-term relationship like the one I have in England, where, I've used future creating workshops, I've used World Cafes, we've used Photo Voice, we've used all of those things over the years that we've been working together. Okay, go ahead. You could also sort of think about who the participants are. What kinds of, background do they have? What kinds of skills do they have? Is language going to be a challenge or an issue in terms of communication? So all of those kinds of, characteristics of the population that you're working with might drive different choices in terms of methodology. Okay, go ahead. What is the issue you're trying to investigate? What, is it about trying to look at organizational issues? Is it about trying to sort of build sort of a future vision? Again, all of those different kinds of things that you're trying to figure out are going to drive a different method, perhaps. Okay, go ahead. And then one of the questions always is, what kind of time and resources do you have? A lot of times you got no time, you got no resources. Fishbone diagrams, as I said, are quick and cheap, but still generate some really useful information. All the way up to, if you have a lot of time and you have reasonable resources, you might be able to do something that's a little bit more elaborate and more extended over, a period of time. So you got to take that into consideration. Okay, go ahead. So the Action Research Journal developed a set of quality criteria that also get reflected. There's a chapter in, there's a book by Trainer and Grau that's all about sort of what are quality criteria for different forms of qualitative research. And these are sort of expanded on in there, but go ahead. So if you want to know what makes a good participatory research or CBPR or action research article, these are the things that as editors, we'd be looking for in submissions to that journal. Does that make sense? So things like, are the objectives of the project or the study clearly articulated? Do you talk about partnership and participation? And it doesn't mean that you have to, that there's like a litmus test, if it has to be this level of partnership, because you have to be pragmatic about it. That was one of the affordances. You have to sort of think about, well, what is possible? But to describe it, if you're submitting an article. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. And then things like what kind of method and process do you use? Particularly if you're publishing in a journal that's focused on a methodology, the readers of that journal are going to be most interested in how did you do what you did? And so a description of what the methodology is important. Is it actionable? What are you going to, can we do something about it? Is there reflexivity involved? Is the person really thinking about, well, what was the meaning of that for me and what have I learned through the process? And then what's the significance of that project? Okay, go ahead. So sort of the last thing I want to talk about is how do we share knowledge from participatory research processes or CBPR? And I think it's important, and this is someplace that I think the university has to really adapt, is that we go beyond just sort of standard, impact factor listed journals and counting up the number of publications we have in a given year, because frankly most academic journal articles don't make a real difference in the world when it comes right down to it. They're important for us and it's an important way for us to share knowledge, but there are other ways in which we can disseminate knowledge that I think are more effective, frankly, in creating positive change. So things like, publishing in local newsletters, the project that we talked about in Eastern Kentucky, the Flash Project. There's a newsletter that comes out from the Cowan Community Center, who's one of our community partners, and we try to get updates from our Flash Project in the Cowan Community Center newsletter. Other newspaper articles, just, that come out to the community, blog posts, podcasts, things like running workshops, doing presentations, training manuals, all sort of performances, all different ways in which we can share the knowledge that we're generating in ways that are going to be more accessible to the community. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so I think this is nearing the end. Go ahead. So what makes research matter? This is a question I ask my students to kind of reflect on. It should address a genuine problem of practice. It should provide opportunities for individuals and communities that are most often unheard of to participate in research about issues that are important to them. It should recognize and build upon community strengths and assets, as we said earlier, encourages more democratic ways of generating knowledge and taking action, provides opportunities for the development of new skills and new ways of understanding the world, provides opportunities for creativity and exploration, connects theory to practice in innovative ways, works to achieve change on multiple levels. Knowledge is shared with new audiences. And your research matters, our research matters when we take responsibility for making a difference in the world, which I think right now is sort of challenging, to think about making a difference in the world. It feels sort of overwhelming, but I have to admit that for me, I just came back late yesterday from a trip out to Eastern Kentucky, and we had a field trip with a bunch of our 8th graders out to this beautiful research forest that's owned by UK. And just feeling like all these young people are having a chance to learn about the environment and connect to the environment in new ways and develop new knowledge. It's not changing everything, but it does feel like a very practical and concrete way of doing some good in the world, which I find comforting right now. Go ahead. So after all these years, I said I've been at this, right, for 40 years. And this past year, I decided that actually I could like boil it all down to 4 basic principles. And the 4 basic principles of doing any kind of participatory action research or CBPR are show up, hang out, help out, and shut up. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, if you think about those four elements, you'll be in good shape. Okay, go ahead. Okay, so I don't think I can answer, like, if you have questions, I'm happy to address questions. Why don't you post them in the Q&A and I can sort of get to as many of them as I can. And maybe you can help me with that. And you all can read the Q&A, so also read what other folks are saying, because I see here Melissa has posted something about what she's been doing. Yeah, she's talking about PALAR, Participatory Action Learning and Action Research. That's something that was developed by Ortrun Zuber-Skerrit. And there's a relatively recent book out about PALAR that Ortrun Zuber-Skerrit did with Leslie Wood, who's actually the person I work with at Northwest University in South Africa. And participatory action learning and action research is about, there's got to be sort of a learning process that communities do sort of internally before they go out and start, trying to do research that's going to affect things. So it's a different model, but if you look up Ortrun Zuber-Skerrit, it's Zuber-Skerrit, Zuber-Skerrit, you can learn more about it. And like I say, they've got this new book about it. There's also a lot of stuff about sort of first, second, and third person action research. First person is sort of that reflective process that we do. And there's some like self-study that really focuses primarily on first person action research. Second person is kind of the participatory action learning piece of it. And then the third person is the action research piece. There's also the Australian Action Learning Action Research Association. They do a lot of work with action learning as well. So action learning has been a concept that's kind of been out there. Anybody else got questions or comments?
Well, while we're waiting, I just
Yep.
want to say this was such an outstanding presentation. I really appreciate the examples of how to get started, how to, actually how to take those steps to build these types of projects. It's been really wonderful.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I realize it's sort of a whirlwind tour. And like I say, I hope it's kind of, sometimes when I talk about this, I use a picture. This is where this picture kind of comes in of the methodology candy store, because it does feel to me kind of like a candy store where you go in and you want you want to try everything. And there are all of those options. So exploring different ways of, I'm always sort of frustrated when I read qualitative research textbooks, and it's sort of the usual suspects. It's as if the only things we could do with people are interviews, observations, and focus groups. And I get frustrated because there are so many more creative and frankly more effective ways of learning with people than just always sticking to those sort of tried and true methods. But hopefully this kind of gives us some ideas about other things we could do.
Yeah, definitely.
So Miley is asking about what does it mean for communities to own the research? It's maybe a more loaded question, Miley, than you realize, because if you think about IRB processes, right? The way human subjects review processes are generally set up is very much sort of biased toward the idea that researchers have to own the research, right? You're supposed to store all the data and have it all secured and have it all, de-identified. When in a real community-based participatory research or PAR kind of context, the best answer would be for the data to be owned by the community. And I mean, like literally, they own the data and they give you access to it to help sort of make sense of it and to share it and to sort of use as your research. But that can just be really tricky. So when I say own the research, like if I think about the project that I'm doing in England, the Gloucestershire Gateway Trust project, every year what I would do is I would work with a community resident research team, which is to hire people from that community who gather the data. And then the data that we collect is given to the board of trustees of the organization, who make decisions about funding based on that information. But the information that's collected belongs to the trust. It doesn't belong to me at all. So it's sort of more like you're serving as, in some ways, more like as an external evaluator almost, than you are as an in-house, university-based research traditional sort of role. So when I think about owning the research, I mean it quite literally. Menu of methodologies, it's helpful. Any other questions people have? Let's see, what else have we got? Got a few more minutes. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, maybe I could take a minute while people are thinking about questions to say a little bit more about this Flash initiative that we're working on now. This is an NSF-funded project, and it is it's interesting because we were very explicit about having a participatory action research component to the study. And when we applied, 3 years ago, and we didn't get funding, and what they said was, we'd like to know more about the participatory action research. So when we resubmitted, we included more information about that, and we were successful. I'm actually seeing a lot more interest in participatory methods generally from funders, whether it's NSF or the National Institutes of Justice. I was reviewing a bunch of proposals from them last year that was specifically for an action research project. And my concern is that I see more and more, I worry about people just using the terminology, without having any of the kind of values that we talked about that are associated with doing more participatory action research, or CBPR. I worry that we're going to be killed off by our friends and not our enemies, in the sense that people who just start using that language, but it's not really participatory, it's not really at all collaborative, it's still very researcher driven, but maybe community placed, but not community based research. So I'm concerned about that. And I hope that our Flash project isn't that, because we really have done a lot of work over this past, the first year of the project, to develop really strong community partnerships. I was just out there on Monday talking to folks about our community advisory board and the membership in that community advisory board, and a larger community partnership group who really helps to guide us in terms of what we're doing. And just as one example, we hadn't really thought about sedimentation in streams as being a central part of what we're doing, but it turns out that sedimentation is really important to people in the community. And that's been part of it. Another part that came up that was really interesting was about, we're trying to monitor streams in the area for flooding. And this is, for those of you who don't know, Eastern Kentucky was just almost literally wiped off the map in 2022 in a huge flood. And then just recently, earlier this year in February, there were more floods. And it's going to happen more frequently. I mean, we just know that because of climate change. So really trying to work with the communities. But one of the things we did was to work with the Kentucky Association for Environmental Education to organize their outdoor learning symposium for teachers. So helping teachers think about how to take kids outdoors. And one of the things I learned from talking to some of the early childhood educators was that if there's any kind of significant rain event at all going on, kids just can't learn. They're so distracted by the rain and by being fearful about another flood that they just kind of, that's all they can think about during the day. And it occurred to me in talking to the teachers that while we were thinking that what we needed to do was to predict flooding, it's at least as important that we predict when flooding isn't happening, and we have like a monitor. This is what we're going to do eventually, is have a big screen monitor in the school that teachers understand how the data is being fed real time into the monitor so that if there is going to be a flood event, we can see when that's happening. But we can also reassure children when the monitor is flat that flooding isn't going to take place. So, learning that as a different sort of mindset for the importance of the project was something that we really took out of these conversations with teachers, and is, I think, an important element in why community partnerships and collaborations like this are so important. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm actually sort of curious as far as, your concerns about the misrepresentation of community-based participatory research projects. Do you see this happening at the start? Or do you think initially the right intentions are there, but somewhere throughout the process, the collaboration with the community fades?
Yeah. One of my all-time favorite presentation titles that I came up with was The Road to Hell. And it's all about, the idea that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I do like to think that for the most part, people think that, they are going to be doing good and supporting people in communities. But if you don't get off to the right start, if you're not, and it's really hard to get off to the right start. For instance, like you have to have, before you can start collecting any data, you have to have already decided everything you're going to do, at least according to human subjects review processes, right? Because they want to know exactly what's going to happen. And when I go in and I say, well, I'm going to talk to people and then we'll see, that's not a very satisfactory answer, according to IRBs, So we're always sort of trying to, it's like a, square peg in a round hole, kind of fit what we want to do into existing sort of structures of control, which makes it really challenging. So I think having some kind of strategy for, and that's where reflexivity is really important, that we're able to reflect on, what are the values? One of the other things that I've done is to develop this structured ethical reflection process that's all about identifying with a group a set of values that you and they, together feel are the ethical principles or values that you want to have guide your research process. And then revisiting those at each stage of the research process to say, if I say that mutual trust is an important value to me, and I get to the point of seeking funding, how is the mutual trust that I said is important to us in this project, how's that being reflected in the way that I'm seeking funding? And we very rarely think about funding as an ethical challenge in research, but really, I mean, he who pays the piper, calls the shots or calls the tune. So, I think it's really important to have strategies built in to help keep us mindful of the ethical principles that we want to be enacting in our work, both on an individual and on a collective basis.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And there's if you're interested in the structured ethical reflection, I've published some work on that, and both individually and some with other folks. And I know at least one of my students, Chris Millett, is on here who has done this in class. So I have my students start this at the beginning of their program, and then I want to see it as part of a dissertation and hope that people sort of carry on that process of ethical reflection through their careers.
Yeah, can I find that online? If I just
or just email me and I'll send you, we can post a copy someplace to people. But yeah, if you look up, my name and structured ethical reflection, there's in a couple of the SAGE handbooks. I don't know, SAGE seemed to be in a handbook kick for a while, so.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely follow up.
Yeah, and if other folks who are here, I'm just sorry that this doesn't allow us to be have more of a conversation, but I'd be happy to have a conversation with any of you. So if you want to find a time for a coffee or something, just send me an email and let me know. I'd be happy to talk to folks more one-on-one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Miller. This was a fantastic presentation. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties and these town hall, this just has to go. So, but thank you so much.
Okay, it was nice to meet you all, sort of at least remotely, and hope to hear some of you in the future. Thanks so much for organizing.
Yes, thank you.
Take care,
everyone.